We've been talking the last 4 weeks about how the Bible is scientifically accurate. This week we're moving on to the history part, historically true. And we'll get into how the Bible is also internally consistent and inspired and prophetically proven. So again, we're on the 5th week. We're going to cover archaeology tonight. We'll look at samples, some things from the Old Testament and the New Testament. And I'll get a little plug in already for next week. Next week also is in the history category. And we're going to cover manuscript evidence. Well, what does that mean? Well, basically that's going to answer the question, how do we know if the Bible's been corrupted? How do we know that what we read today is the same as what was originally written? How can we know that? What kind of evidence is there to support that? Those types of things. So that'll be next week. But for tonight, we're going to get into archaeological evidence. And I'm going to start off with a question. Do you believe that Julius Caesar was a real person? And why or why not? So what do you think? I see heads nodding. So yes, he was a real person. The big question then, why do you think that? Because there's a play about him? Is that what somebody said? Okay, yeah. He's real. Why do you say he's real? Because Heather said so. So, okay. Yeah. Why else? Why do you think, why is it kind of a no-brainer?
He's written about in history books and documented that he was who he was.
Okay, so he's written about in history books, all kinds of documentation about Julius Caesar, that type of thing. Okay, that's a good answer. So what about Jesus? Do you believe that Jesus was, or I should say is, a real person?
Yes.
Very nice. For the same reason. So if there was any hesitation at all, depending on where you stand, think about that. Why would you treat that differently? Because as Stacy mentioned, the documentation, the history, anything like that. So we're going to get into the archaeological side of it. But first, let's talk about just different types of historical evidence for the Bible. So there's archaeology, there's manuscript evidence, including the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then there's also external, or what we could call extra-biblical, so outside of the Bible evidence by non-Christian writers, as well as early church fathers as well. And again, tonight we're going to focus on the archaeological discoveries. So when we talk about evidence, let's kind of back up a little bit. There's different kinds of evidence. There's analytical evidence, so you can prove by mathematical definition. So for example, in the first week when we talked about the Big Bang Theory, Stephen Hawking and others proved mathematically that time had a beginning, okay, as part of what we call the Big Bang. There's also statistical evidence. So it's kind of like proving by probability, right? There's like the design class that we talked about the galaxy and the Earth and the moon and some of those types of things. So different kind of evidence. And then there's what's called legal evidence. And so if you think about legal evidence, just like in a trial, in a court of law today, legal evidence is about confirming one-time historical events, and it uses eyewitness testimony as well as a circumstantial or physical evidence. So obviously archaeology fits into the legal evidence. It's not fair to try to fit it into to any other type of evidence, but it definitely fits that. So the question, can archaeology prove the Bible? Well, the answer is no. If we mean, can archaeology can prove it to be the inspired word of God? No, not directly. But we can say, yes, archaeology can prove the Bible if we mean that it can show that some person, place, event, those types of things to be historical. So it can definitely show that the Bible is accurate from a historical standpoint with respect to people, places, objects, events, those types of things. So as how archaeology fits with other evidence, you get this historical event. And so you have confirmation by eyewitnesses, written confirmation. We have confirmation by hostile witnesses. So what's a hostile witness? A hostile witness is somebody who, disagrees with, is against that, but because of that, they don't have a bias in favor of that person or that event, whatever the case would be. So they're considered really, truly unbiased, which makes their testimony even a little stronger. There's written confirmation from historians. And then there's circumstantial confirmation, the physical evidence, if you will, by artifacts and other remains. That's the archaeological side. So what is archaeology? It's a systematic study of things that ancient cultures have left behind. And when we talk about biblical archaeology, we're talking about the systematic study of things that ancient biblical cultures have left behind. And what we'll find is that biblical archaeology confirms, as you can see, clarifies and complements the Bible, and it also supports its reliability. So this is a quote by William F. Albright. He was a very famous archaeologist, biblical archaeologist. Discovery after discovery has established the accuracy of innumerable details and has brought increased recognition of the value of the Bible as a source of history. So that kind of kicks things off. We're going to talk more about William F. Albright here in a little later as well. So again, I'm going to go through these relatively quickly. But if you have questions or comments or whatever, feel free to stop at any point in time. So how we're going to go about this, we're going to basically go through a sampling of discoveries from the Old Testament, and we're going to go through a sampling of discoveries from the New Testament. And throughout all that, we're going to cover evidence relating to different people, to different places, events, objects, that type of thing. So kind of a sampling kind of across the board of various things. And again, we're going to start with the Old Testament. The Tower of Babel, or Babel, you may have heard it called. There's many structures called ziggurats. They've been discovered in ancient cities in the region where the Tower of Babel is believed to have existed. And Babel actually means gateway to God. And these ziggurats were very high towers that have a shrine at the top. And actually, archaeologically, they found that they're made from brick, which is exactly what it says in the Bible in Genesis 11:3. And as far as the Tower of Babel itself, there have been 2 sites that have been proposed for that tower itself. And what's really interesting is that one fragment of a clay tablet found in Babylon actually talks of a temple that so offended the gods that it was destroyed one night and the people were scattered with their speech made strange, which is a parallel to, or like a pagan account of exactly what the Bible records in Genesis 11, which is pretty interesting. Sodom and Gomorrah, in Genesis 19, talks about Sodom and Gomorrah. The Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. And archaeologists believe they've identified the sites of both Sodom and Gomorrah. Bab Edra is Sodom, is believed to be Sodom, and Numera is believed to be Gomorrah. And some pictures here. There's been quite a bit of excavation over time. You can see these are actually black and white, many of them. And so, as I mentioned, Bab Edra appears to be the location of Sodom, Numera the location of Gomorrah. And as far as a few details around the sites, there's a large graveyard that shows mass simultaneous burial. And even more impressive, there's a thick layer of ash, several feet thick in places, that covers the ruins. And archaeologists were actually able to piece together, through carefully looking at the evidence, that some of the buildings actually burned from fire that started on the roof, which exactly matches the Genesis account. The Hittites are a people that are mentioned nearly 50 times throughout Scripture. And what's really interesting is a little over 100 years ago, New Testament scholars, some liberal New Testament scholars, they believe that there was questions, I guess, whether they were real people, whether they really existed. Because at that point in time, there was no evidence. And so they questioned that. I think higher criticism was the name of that movement or that group. But starting in 1876, there's actually been hundreds of Hittite artifacts uncovered, like some of the things that you see there, both from structural standpoint, writing, all kinds of different things. So the Hittites definitely were as I said, over 100 and some years ago, some of the liberal critics questioned whether they existed, and obviously the evidence that's now been uncovered is overwhelming for that. Likewise, this same movement that was really popular in the late 1800s, they argued that the first 5 books of the Bible that Moses wrote, the Pentateuch, well, it couldn't have been written because writing wasn't advanced, or writing didn't really exist, and advanced laws like that couldn't have been in place at the time. They couldn't have been in existence during the time of Moses. And this so-called black steel, this law code of Hammurabi, was discovered in 1902 in Babylon, and it actually has detailed laws that was written well before the time of Moses. And so just further evidence outside the Bible that, hey, writing was very much developed, advanced laws were very much in place. So from that standpoint, that argument doesn't hold water. Kind of along the same lines, there were some that said King David was a myth because they had not found archaeological evidence until 1993, actually. And this Tel Dan stele was unearthed at that point at a location called Tel Dan. And it's an inscription that contains House of David, which is circled and highlighted up there. And so that's the first reference to David that's found outside the Bible, or the Jewish Bible, which is called the Tanakh. So kind of a common theme on those three, that at different points in time, certain liberal scholars questioned the existence, and then evidence was uncovered that refuted that and backed up the Bible's testimony. Kind of switch gears a little bit. This is a place. It's called En-Gedi. It's where David went when he was pursued by Saul. And it's on the western part of the Dead Sea, as you can see from that map. Very rugged place. You can see this verse from 1 Samuel. After Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told David is in the desert of En-Gedi. And one reference. So what I've tried to do on a lot of these slides is give you at least a reference that points to the person or the place or that type of thing. But there are also several caves in this area. And I don't know if you recall, but the Bible records how David was hiding in a cave and Saul came in, and David actually had the chance to kill him if he wanted to, and decided not to. And there's more to that than more to that story. But in any case, this is En-Gedi, and it's still a popular location where, as you can see, tourists and others go to visit. Kind of an oasis on the western side of the Dead Sea. King Solomon, had several stables, right? This was the height of Israel's glory, was during King Solomon's reign. You can see these 2 verses here from 1 Kings chapter 9. Here is the account of the forced labor King Solomon conscripted, if I could say that, to build the Lord's temple, his own palace, the supporting terraces, the wall of Jerusalem, and Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. And it goes on later to say that he built as well all his store cities and the towns for his chariots and for his horses, whatever he desired to build in Jerusalem and Lebanon and throughout all the territory that he ruled. So there's actually been excavations at all 3 of these cities, Gezer, Hazor, and Megiddo. And all 3 of them show an identical gate and casement wall structure. Not only that, but they contain pottery that can be dated to the time of Solomon. And I forget which one it was. I think it might have been the one on the left, Gezer. Well, let's start with this one in the middle. Hazor, you see that structure in the middle? I think it was Gezer when they were excavating. They were excavating over on what's on the right-hand side for us. And once they kind of put it together that this may be one of Solomon's rebuilt cities, and they knew the other cities and that layout, they said, let's dig out this area a little bit more because they were basically using the others as kind of a map of what it should look like, what they were looking for. And so another example of using scripture to help them in archaeology to find that common pattern based on the way Solomon had approached that. King Jehu, in 1945, this black obelisk of Shalmaneser, who was an Assyrian king, was discovered. And it actually has an inscription on it that says, "Tribute of Jehu, son of Omri." And so basically, if you can think of, at the time, this was kind of like a Polaroid of an Israelite king. And he's a bit close up here. I believe he's the one that's kneeling as he's given tribute to King Shalmaneser. So this was a pretty exciting discovery at the time, because really it was the first picture of an Israelite king at the time. Continuing on, this is a seal from King Ahaz. So if you think of this seal, back in those times, if you're not familiar with it, this was a clay seal. And so in order to know if something was officially coming from the king, they had to have some proof to know that this document, for example, was from the king. And so they would put clay on the document, and then they would have a ring or something else similar to that they would push into the clay, and it would have the impression of that. And then obviously for clay it would harden and that type of thing. And so they could know that it was legitimate, that it was truly from the king. And then over time, even though it's fragile, some of these have survived. And so this is one of them. So this belongs to King Ahaz, who was the son of Jotham, king of Judah, referenced in 2 Kings chapter 16, which is kind of cool. Similarly, this is King Hezekiah's seal. So it says, "Belong to Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah." So same concept. What's interesting is that it has that, you can see the influence of the Egyptians, right? What do you call that? The dung beetle. So that Egyptian influence actually in the seal itself. Pretty interesting. While we're on Hezekiah, we know some more details about Hezekiah in 2 Kings chapter 20. It kind of sums up Hezekiah's reign, talks about his achievements, but it also talks about how he made the pool and the tunnel by which he brought water into the city. And in 2 Chronicles, it details that as well, and it says that it was Hezekiah who blocked the upper outlet of the Gihon spring and channeled the water down the west side of the city of David. And so the story behind this is that when Hezekiah was threatened by an Assyrian king, Sennacherib, in 701 BC, strategically Hezekiah knew they were in trouble because their water supply was kind of unprotected. And so if the Assyrians would get to the water supply, then obviously Jerusalem would be in a world of hurt. And so he actually built a tunnel that was nearly 2,000 feet long, 1,180 feet long, it's 6 feet high, and it directed the water from the spring to the pool of Siloam, so that the city would have its water. And they've actually found an inscription that describes how workers started at each end, which is an engineering marvel if you think about it. And as they got closer, they could hear each other digging as they finally met in the middle. So on the right is actually a picture of the tunnel, and on the left is kind of a cutaway view just to give you an idea. Kind of on the right-hand side, you can see where the spring the spring was in the tunnel, so the tunnel snakes its way all the way down to the lower left-hand corner. That's what they had dug out to be able to have that water supply. It's still there today. The tunnel still has some water in it. I have a very good friend who lives in Memphis who's been in this tunnel more than once. And so this is Hezekiah's tunnel, and pretty interesting, very important strategically. While we're on Hezekiah and Sennacherib, Isaiah prophesied that God would protect Jerusalem against the attack, and they were really outnumbered. The Assyrians were wreaking havoc throughout the region. So Hezekiah and Isaiah prayed together, and then an angel of the Lord actually killed 185,000 Assyrians the night after the prophecy. So from outside the Bible, there's been 2 cylinders discovered, the Taylor cylinder and what's called the Oriental Institute cylinder. And both confirm the unusual events, and they talk quite a bit about Sennacherib's defeat of many cities, yet they acknowledge the failure to conquer Jerusalem. And so this is the Taylor prism, and this is what it says. So this is what the prism says. As for Hezekiah the Judean, who did not submit to my yoke, I surrounded and conquered 46 of his strong-walled towns. He himself I shut up in Jerusalem, in his royal city, like a bird in a cage. The warriors and select troops he had brought in did not fight. He sent his messengers to pay tribute. So what's interesting is that, there's affirmation from Sennacherib's standpoint of how he had conquered these other strong-walled towns. He had them surrounded in Jerusalem, but notice what he didn't say. He didn't say that we conquered Jerusalem. He said that, he sent his messengers to pay tribute. And so, interesting affirmation that Jerusalem was surrounded with no hope of escape, yet they were not conquered, just like the prophecy said. These are called the Lachish reliefs. There's about 90 feet of them. And you have Sennacherib, the Assyrian king, on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, it's kind of hard to tell, but you actually have archers on the top of a wall. And all those objects you see flying through the air are arrows. So this is kind of like, imagine an action shot of a battle in process, and that's kind of what is depicted here. So you have you have Lachish, for example, as a city defending itself from the towers. You have the Assyrians shooting arrows and actually a battering ram and everything. And so there's a whole relief of several of these that relate the battle, just kind of the way that we see right here. This is another seal. This one is of Baruch, who was the prophet Jeremiah's scribe. This seal was found in 1975, and you can see, Baruch, son of Neriah, the scribe, just as Jeremiah describes it in Jeremiah chapter 36. There was a second seal found in 1996. This one was really cool. It actually had a fingerprint. You can kind of make it out a little bit in the upper left-hand corner where that arrow is. So as Baruch was sealing this up and put the imprint on the clay, actually pushed down the clay with his fingerprint's still on there. So it's kind of like CSI from quite some time ago. You have Nebuchadnezzar and Jehoiachin. This is from 2 Kings chapter 24. It says that at that time the officers of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, advanced on Jerusalem and laid siege to it. And Nebuchadnezzar himself came up to the city while his officers were besieging it. Jehoiachin, king of Judah, his mother, his attendants, his nobles, and his officials all surrendered to him. In the 8th year of the king of Babylon, he took Jehoiachin prisoner. So we also have this cylinder of that Nebuchadnezzar had put together about the conquest in Jerusalem. There's also this tablet that basically echoes what's written in 2 Kings chapter 24 that says Nebuchadnezzar took Jehoiachin captive to Babylon. He also took from Jerusalem to Babylon the king's mother, his wives, his officials, and the leading men of the land. And so this tablet actually records rations. And among this tablet is the text which lists the food supplies delivered to notables who were either prisoners or they were dependent on the royal household for their rations. And specifically, Jehoiachin, king of Judah, and his 5 sons are listed in those rations. Wesley.
Can you just repeat for me, please, where the Bible, the details of Nebuchadnezzar's conquest of Jerusalem is found?
Yeah, actually, it's from 2 Kings chapter 24. Sure. So 2 Kings 24. These verses are from verses 10 through 12. Cyrus. We're going to talk more about Cyrus at a later time. But from an archaeological standpoint, Cyrus was the king of the Medes and the Persians. He's referred to as Cyrus the Great. You can see his tomb actually is in south central Iran. He unified the Medes and the Persians, which was into a unified nation, and you can see the territory actually that the Medo-Persian Empire had. That's Turkey on the left-hand side, through Iran, Iraq, and so on. So quite a bit of territory. Conquered Babylon in 539 BC, and what's interesting is he didn't even have a battle. Once he did that, he allowed the Jewish captives to return back to their homeland. So the Jewish captives were in Babylon, like Daniel, for example, were in Babylon. They had been exiled, and then when Cyrus came into power and conquered them, he allowed them to go back not only to their homeland, but also to rebuild the temple. This is the Cyrus cylinder that was unearthed in 1879. It was found in Babylon. And it says that I returned to these sacred cities on the other side of the Tigris, the sanctuaries of which have been ruins for a long time, and established for them permanent sanctuaries. I also gathered all their former inhabitants and returned to them their habitations. So exactly matching what is covered in Scripture, and I know I skipped over that. So like, for example, Ezra chapter 1, 2 Chronicles 36, Isaiah chapters 44 and 45 are all references to this type of event. So time and time again, you can see there's these, the Bible mentions these events, these people, these places, these things, and then archaeological evidence supports that wholeheartedly. The Dead Sea Scrolls, they're considered by many to be the most important religious archaeological find, certainly, and some people think they're probably take the religious word out of it. They're the most important archaeological find in history, especially in our time. They were discovered in 1947, and actually a shepherd boy happened across them in Qumran in the Dead Sea area. Actually, this background, let me back up a little bit. This background that you see here, as well as the smaller picture on the left, that's the type of area. Those are the caves, some of the caves that the Dead Sea Scrolls came out of. So very rugged area, which is why it took so long for them to be discovered. Not easy to get to. They found, this shepherd boy found all these jars, and these scrolls were hidden in jars that were in the caves. The scrolls had been hidden no later than AD 70, and they went back to at least around the time of Christ, AD 70, and sometimes some of them were even written 1 or 2 centuries before Christ. And about, as you can see, about a third of the scrolls were Old Testament books, with a copy of at least every book in the Old Testament, with the exception of Esther. And the remaining scrolls were about the culture and the life of this Jewish sect at the time, but again, some magnificent discoveries relative to the Old Testament. We're going to spend more time on the Dead Sea Scrolls next week, as far as why were they considered such an important archaeological find, and how that helps us really know specifically about the reliability of the biblical text. We'll get into that next week, but a great archaeological find that's happened here, and starting in 1947, took several years actually to find all of them, and they're still going through and cataloging and working on them. So as far as some archaeological discoveries, we'll get into the New Testament. Any questions on what we covered so far? I know it's kind of rapid fire. Yeah.
So opponents of the Bible or the scientific reliability Bible, what would they say, or what do they say about all these discoveries that match up with what was in the Bible?
Good question. It varies. There's some, we're actually going to go through a couple archaeologists who started off believing that the Bible was not inspired. Maybe it wasn't written the time that, it was written after. They thought maybe certain parts of the Bible were written after what they're historically held to be, so they didn't think they were that accurate, and then what the discoveries kind of meant to them. Obviously, many of these discoveries, they're by archaeologists and others that are kind of all ends of the spectrum, right? Some may have been Christians, many of them were not, and they're all, all the discoveries have to be verified and that type of thing. So, that's a good question. I can't really give you a specific answer, but obviously a lot of evidence on the Old Testament, and we're going to go through some New Testament things as well. So the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, these are a couple of models of what the temple and the Temple Mount may have looked like during the time of Jesus. On the right-hand side actually is a model that they have in Jerusalem of not only the temple but the surrounding area as well, from what the Bible tells us. Today, the Temple Mount has the Muslim Dome of the Rock Mosque on it, which you can see prominently there. And on the picture on the right is kind of a close-up of the Wailing Wall, which was an original part of the structure, one of the few that remains from when the Romans attacked and basically leveled Jerusalem, including the temple and much of the Temple Mount. So the Western Wailing Wall is left, which is why the Jews consider that such a holy place, and they say their prayers there and really hold that very highly. There's a temple warning sign that was found in the late 1800s related to the Jewish temple. And as you can see there, kind of humorous actually, it says, "No foreigner may enter within the barricade which surrounds the temple and enclosure. Anyone who is caught doing so will have himself to thank for his ensuing death." And so making it clear that, hey, there are places you should be and there's places you shouldn't be. The reference there to Acts 21 is where Paul was kind of run off. He was accused of bringing someone with him that shouldn't have been in that area. And so this is the type of sign that was there at the time. That kind of explains part of the reasoning behind that. Still with the Jewish temple, there's a large section of the upper balustrade. It's basically kind of think of it like the railing around the top. It was found exactly where the Roman army had toppled it. And there's an inscription on it that states, "To the trumpeting place." So you see the close-up on the right-hand side of that. This was the place where the priests stood to blow the silver trumpets that would summon the Jews to the temple. So let me back up a little bit. You may or may not be aware of this because there's several New Testament finds that are going to kind of tie into this. In 70 AD, the Romans attacked Jerusalem and basically ransacked it, totally destroyed the temple, just as Jesus actually had prophesied. And literally, with the exception of like the Western Wailing Wall, just leveled it. Leveled the Temple Mount, leveled much of Jerusalem. So there's a lot of things that we'll see here that may relate to that. And so just a little background. So when you hear about, you see things like this, it's because that's a direct result of the Romans coming in and basically ransacking Jerusalem, including the temple and the Temple Mount. This is the same thing. There's ruins of stairs, shops, the street. This is on the western side of the Temple Mount. So you can see what things used to look like as they continue to excavate. King Herod. A few things about King Herod the Great, who, as Luke records, among others, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod was the tetrarch of Galilee, and King Herod was involved in Jesus' trial, among other things. So you had Herod the Great coin. There's an inscription of Herod, and then the Herodium is actually a fortress/palace that's southeast of Bethlehem, actually. And so that's where Herod spent some of his time as well. Speaking of Bethlehem, the Church of the Nativity is in Bethlehem. It marks the traditional site of the birth of Jesus. And construction of the original church was ordered by Constantine's mother. He was the emperor. His mother, Helena, had this church constructed in approximately 330 AD. She actually did that with several early Christian sites. And because of the constant battling that's occurred over time, attempts were made to stop the worship of Jesus by destroying the church, the site, but the church was always rebuilt in the same place and worship resumed. There's been excavation at the site that reveals evidence of earlier churches, this building and rebuilding, including columns and capitals that date back to the time of Constantine. And early writers indicated that Jesus was born in a cave. So we know, Scripture tells us, that he was born in a stable. And some early writers actually say, well, yeah, but caves were a common site for stables at that time. And the exact location of the cave of Jesus' birth is thought to be under an altar that marks the spot in this present-day Church of the Nativity. And there have been excavations that reveal the remains of a cave there. So, again, my friend John, who's a pastor outside of Memphis, ironically, he's the name of his church is Harvest Christian Fellowship. So it used to be a Harvest Christian Fellowship South before we had a Harvest Christian Fellowship. It was the Deep South, Harvest Christian Fellowship Deep South. And he's been here a few times. Loves coming here. He's been to Jerusalem. Marla, how many times do you think he's been to Jerusalem? 4 times? 5 times? Several times. He takes his church and other churches there. He's done it multiple times. He's been to the Church of the Nativity, among other things, and he said, it's really hard when you walk into a church you have this mental image of where Christ's birth was, and then you have this very ornate church that's been built there. And he just said it's kind of hard to wrap your mind around, what you see and what it used to be. So I always thought that was kind of an interesting perspective. Just some more pictures of the Church of the Nativity. Moving on, there was a Galilean fishing boat, and it was discovered near Bethsaida. It's actually fairly large, 26, 27 feet long, you can see, 7.5 feet wide, 4.5 feet high. And so this was the type of boat that was probably used to cross the Sea of Galilee, including the time that Jesus calmed the storm and the time that he walked on water. So no one is claiming that this is the exact boat, but it's a boat from that exact same time period, and it's of the size and type that would have fit that in the area the same area, Bethsaida, from that time period. So pretty cool find. Speaking of Bethsaida, this was an ancient fishing village. It was also the hometown of Simon, Peter, Philip, and Andrew, according to John. And so it's been rediscovered here in recent years. It's on the north shore of Galilee. It's been excavated, as you can see, since 1989. And what they've found is evidence that, it definitely was a fishing village. That makes sense. There's been anchors and fish hooks discovered. And all 4 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, refer to Bethsaida. Capernaum, for example, John chapter 6, verse 59. Jesus said this while teaching in the synagogue in Capernaum. This is the synagogue in Capernaum. So this is exactly on the right-hand side. This is exactly where Jesus was when he was teaching, according to John. On the picture on the left, the synagogue is kind of on the right-hand side, just from a different angle. Peter's house, actually, let me back up. So a picture on the left, The right-hand side of that picture is the synagogue. That octagon-shaped area was Peter's house. And since that time, they've actually built a structure over it. That's the structure you see, the picture on the left. This is kind of a close-up of the house itself. It's been revered for centuries as the house of Peter. And it matches the style of the home that the Bible refers to, where the roof was removed to let down the paralytic. Again, it's located close to the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and they even found fish hooks on the floor. I always thought this was kind of interesting. Graffiti is a bad thing, right? I'm not encouraging graffiti, but they have used graffiti to help date some of these things, or at least to contribute to the dating. And so there's been graffiti that dates back to the 2nd century, and that graffiti has referred to Peter and Jesus, so it's not a more recent thing. This house has been revered as Peter's for, at least since the 2nd century when the graffiti was written. And it's been used as a place of worship with the earliest evidence dating back to the 1st century, so very likely that's Peter's house. The tomb of Lazarus, this is in Bethany. And in John chapter 11, Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. You can see the reference verse down at the bottom. And so this location obviously has been venerated since the earliest times. This was a real big deal to the early church. Obviously, several early writers outside the Bible recorded the existence of it. And there's been artifacts found there that are consistent with the time period we're talking about. And once again, there's been early graffiti that were written by Christians that refers to Lazarus being raised. The Pool of Siloam, this actually is in the last 10 years. Archeologists uncovered the remains of this Pool of Siloam. I'll show you a picture here in a second. It's actually kind of in the middle of a neighborhood in East Jerusalem. And this pool was used by the Jews up until the time it was destroyed again in 70 AD, when the Romans destroyed the Jewish temple. And the pool is about 50 yards long, and it has spring water in it even today. So this was a picture shortly after it had been discovered, and they were doing some initial excavations. It actually was discovered because the city was putting in a new sewer line. That's the pipe that you see running down the left-hand side. There's a new city sewer system. You have the Pool of Siloam and the steps there. And the water is from the Gihon Springs and Hezekiah's tunnel that we talked about. So that actually feeds this. There was another Pool of Siloam that was a little further upstream, or at least it was thought to be the Pool of Siloam until this one was discovered. And at this point in time, the water was still flowing out across the street. So same place. Picture on the left-hand side is kind of an aerial view of the neighborhood. The little blue arrow that you see there is where this happened. So you can see this is just kind of in the middle of a Jewish neighborhood. And some other pictures on the right just to kind of give you a context of where this is relative to the houses and the different things that are around. John chapter 9 is a reference where Jesus healed a man that was born blind and asked him to go wash in the Pool of Siloam. Just some more pictures, just some different angles of the different steps and those types of things for the pool. Another place is the Garden of Gethsemane. And so, for example, in Matthew, among the other Gospels, it talks about, that was a place Jesus commonly went to go and pray. This verse, Matthew 26, verse 36, then Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to them, sit here while I go over there and pray. So still a very vibrant garden there, lots of trees. This is a very ornate, it's called an ossuary or a bone box. It's of Caiaphas, the high priest. It was found in 1990, so not all that long ago. You can see very ornate. The inscription's actually on this left-hand side. And Caiaphas was the high priest. Those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the teachers of the law and the elders had assembled. So that's in Matthew 26. So This is thought to be the ossuary or the bone box of Caiaphas, the high priest. And again, because it's so ornate, that just echoes that that's someone of high position and importance at the time. Pontius Pilate, the Pilate stone. This has an inscription here on the left-hand side. It's inferred to the people of Caesarea, and then where it picks up, Tiberium, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. There's also a coin that was issued by Pilate that honored Tiberius Caesar. And so Pilate obviously was somebody right in the thick of things. Crucifixion. There's actually evidence of crucifixion. These are the remains of a crucified man named Yohanan ben Hagagel, and they were found in 1968 in an ossuary, again a bone box, and it was dated from about the time of Jesus. The ankle bone with the nail in it, you can see, and then on the lower right-hand corner, you have the ankle bone with the nail going through it, and then what it would have looked like at the time, for example. They would reuse these nails, right? I mean, that was a valuable thing, so they would reuse the nails as much as they could. And so with this one being all bent and twisted, they apparently couldn't get it out. They left it in him, and he was buried with the nail still in the ankle bone. About 7 inches long at that, so, but interesting to find direct evidence of crucifixion, again, from someone that's dated around the time of Jesus. The site of Jesus' death and resurrection is marked by the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This church marks the site that most archaeologists agree is the place where Jesus was crucified and where he was resurrected. And obviously, that would have been a very important site to early Christians. What's interesting is the Roman Emperor Hadrian placed a statue of the pagan god Venus on the site of the crucifixion and a similar statue of Jupiter on the tomb of the resurrection. And he did this to paganize it and to basically hope that Christians would forget the sites. But what he did was put up a real value, markers that help mark the sites. Again, Constantine, when he entered the persecution against Christians and made Christianity the state religion, his mother, Helena, just like with the Church in the Nativity, helped erect this church over the two sites. And this church was consecrated in the year 335, and Eusebius, who was an early church father, was present and wrote about it. Like other landmarks at the time, this church has suffered destruction, but it was repeatedly rebuilt, and it stands today. So that's the layout of the church. Again, very ornate. That's the altar where Jesus was apparently crucified in that area. If we move on just to kind of a sampling of some other biblical places, and again, we could be here all night going through some of this, but just a handful of places. There's the Colosseum at Ephesus. So Paul wrote the letter to the Ephesians. He also wrote the letter to the Philippians. So there's ruins in Philippi. Petra, actually, that's really an Old Testament reference. Does anybody recognize that from a movie? Indiana Jones, that's right, Indiana Jones. They use Petra actually as a backdrop in Caesarea as well. So this Erastus pavement, this is pavement that was found in Corinth, you can see. And it says Erastus, curator of public buildings, laid this pavement at his own expense. And they're fairly confident that this is the same Erastus that's referred to in Romans chapter 16. This is verse 23, where Paul says, Erastus, who is the city's director of public works, and our brother Quartus send you their greetings. So with this being Erastus, curator of public buildings, they think this was definitely the same guy. Anybody hear about this? This was in 2002. Does it ring a bell? There's some controversy about this one. This is another ossuary or a bone box. This one says, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. So this is the James that gave us the book of James. So this was a discovery that was in 2002. The controversy, some people think that that portion, brother of Jesus, was added maybe sometime later. So the inscription there is on the lower left. On the upper left, keep in mind that Hebrews read right to left. So James, son of Joseph, typically that's where it would stop, right? Here's who it was, son of this person, son of that person. But obviously because of the significance, brother of Jesus is also included. Even though there's some controversy, this is a letter from the State of Israel's Geological Survey, so an official department. They used a scanning electron microscope, and this letter documents basically what they found doing the scanning electron microscope analysis. And it ends with what's listed up there. No signs of the use of a modern tool or instrument was found. No evidence that might detract from the authenticity of the patina and the inscription was found. And the patina is like a layer that develops over time on things. And they said, hey, it's, there's nothing that would make us think that it's not authentic. So that's pretty cool. I think this is the last one. This one's actually a little bit heartbreaking in my opinion. This is the Titus Arch. It's located in Rome. It's about 51 feet tall, so it's pretty large. You can see people sitting at the base of it in the picture on the right to kind of give you an idea of scale. And there's a relief on the inside that we're going to kind of zoom in on here shortly. But this arch commemorates when the Romans captured and ransacked Jerusalem, again in AD 70. And this was led by Titus, hence the name Arch of Titus. So this is a close-up of the relief on the inside. That is very unique to the menorah, this lampstand. So Exodus, for example, Exodus 25, talks about making the lampstand of pure gold. 6 branches are to extend from the sides of the lampstand, 3 on one side and 3 on the other. And so very clearly the Roman army, once they've ransacked Jerusalem, they've raided the temple and they're carrying back everything that they've acquired during that, including the menorah. On the right is a model or what do I want to say? A duplicate of a menorah that's been made. And so this really, like I said, is kind of heartbreaking from the standpoint that this is a picture of them after they've ransacked the temple and destroyed Jerusalem, taking everything back to Rome. So I know I've kind of rapid fired them at you. We've covered, several Old Testament discoveries. The Tower of Babel, Sodom and Gomorrah, the Hittites, the Law Code of Hammurabi, the House of David, the place En Gedi on the Dead Sea, the Solomon's rebuilt cities and stables, King Jehu, King Ahaz, King Hezekiah from some different angles, including his tunnel and his interaction with the Assyrian king Sennacherib, Baruch, Jeremiah's scribe, Nebuchadnezzar and Jehoiachin, Cyrus the Great, and the Dead Sea Scrolls, among others. And from a New Testament standpoint, we've talked about all those. The Jewish temple, King Herod, the Church of the Nativity, the Galilean fishing boat, Bethsaida, which is the fishing village that's been rediscovered, the synagogue in Capernaum where Jesus taught, among other places, Peter's house in Capernaum, the tomb of Lazarus, the pool of Siloam, which was discovered here recently, the Garden of Gethsemane, Caiaphas the high priest, his bone box, ossuary, Pontius Pilate, the evidence for crucifixion, that ankle bone with the nail still in it, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where Jesus is commemorating Jesus' death and resurrection, other places, and the Erastus pavement, the James ossuary, even though it's controversial, and then the Arch of Titus in Rome. And so we went through all those fairly quickly, and I just would mention, we just hit the highlights, right? We could go on. There's literally thousands of artifacts that have been found that relate to the people, places that are mentioned in the Bible. And if you think about it, what's truly amazing is that only a fraction of what's made or written survives. And then of those, only a fraction of those are discovered. And then really you could carry that on, and only a fraction of those are really cataloged and investigated. And so it's pretty amazing. One thing to point out is that the absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence. What's that mean? Well, just because evidence hasn't been uncovered yet, hasn't been found for a particular person or place, doesn't necessarily mean that person or place never existed. It's kind of like the situation we talked about earlier. Certain higher critics, quote unquote, claim that David, the Hittites, advanced writing and laws in Moses' time hadn't been discovered. So then they were discovered. Just because there's not evidence at this point in time doesn't mean that that's evidence of absence. Does that make sense? Try to say that fast 10 times. Absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence. So the key point is that the more often that archaeologists do their thing, the more often they use their shovel, the more evidence for the reliability of the Bible is found. And just like we talked about from a scientific standpoint, there's nothing to fear from the facts. There's a quote from William F. Albright that we touched on earlier. And Albright was, as a young man, regarded the Bible as only a book of literature. He didn't think it was really historical. And he intended to kind of use archaeology to figure out how a book like the Bible, not historically true, but just a piece of literature, kind of how it fit into the culture of the time. And during his studies, which started in the 30s and really went up until his death in 71, he found conclusive evidence to reverse his previous position. So he actually became one of the biggest advocates for the Bible and stated that, in fact, it was totally consistent. The Bible was totally consistent with archaeological findings. Very well-known scholar, wrote more than 800 books, and specialized quite a bit on the validity of manuscripts. So we'll get into what that means in a little more next week. But Albright is best known for his work confirming the authenticity of the Old Testament, and especially the Dead Sea Scrolls. He said there can be no doubt that archaeology has confirmed the substantial historicity of the Old Testament tradition. And he also said discovery after discovery has established the accuracy of innumerable details and has brought increased recognition of the value of the Bible as a source of history. Another gentleman by the name of Sir William Ramsay, he was arguably the greatest archaeologist of his day. He actually believed that the books of Luke and Acts were written about 150 AD, and therefore they couldn't really be authentic, at least not authentic first century documents as they had been claimed. And so because of that, he really rejected a lot of the New Testament as being factual, and he's essentially going to go out and prove it false. And so specifically, he went out to disprove the book of Luke and Acts, for that matter. He went out to disprove Luke, which Luke wrote the book of Luke and the book of Acts. And so that took him all over the place, 32 countries. What's interesting is when he finally did publish, the academic world was shocked because they knew that he was against the Bible and they knew his views. And so when he started publishing, he had instead found strong confirmation of the Bible. And so they were really shocked that when they thought he would be slamming on the Bible, he was actually really talking strongly about how accurate and reliable it was, and in particular Luke's works. So in his own words, he said, "I began with a mind unfavorable to it, but more recently I found myself brought into contact with the book of Acts as an authority for the topography, antiquities, and society of Asia Minor. It was gradually borne upon me that in various details the narrative showed marvelous truth." Ramsay also said that Luke is a historian of the first rank. So keep in mind, he thought he thought the book of Luke and the book of Acts were pretty bogus, and he comes out and says, hey, Luke is a historian of the first rank. This author should be placed along with the very greatest of historians. And that Luke's history is unsurpassed in respect of its trustworthiness. So he basically did a 180-degree flip on his initial views. So time and again, he would, his search to find evidence against the Bible showed evidence in favor of it. And actually, as a result of this, Sir William Ramsay eventually converted to Christianity. It was that strong an argument. And his respect for especially the Luke's writings convinced him of that. Some other quotes about biblical archaeology. F.F. Bruce here, biblical scholar, says, a man whose accuracy can be demonstrated in matters where we are able to test it is likely to be accurate where the means for testing him are not available. Accuracy is a habit of mind, and we know from happy or unhappy experience that some people are habitually accurate, just as others can be depended upon to be inaccurate. Luke's record entitles him to be regarded as a writer of habitual accuracy. Merrill Unger, another Bible scholar, said that Old Testament archaeology has rediscovered whole nations, resurrected important peoples, and in a most astonishing manner filled in historical gaps, adding immeasurably to the knowledge of biblical backgrounds. And Miller Burroughs, another Bible scholar, leading authority on the Dead Sea Scrolls, said that on the whole, however, archaeological work has unquestionably strengthened confidence in the reliability of the scriptural record. More than one archaeologist has found his respect for the Bible increased by the experience of excavation in Palestine. And Sir Frederick Kenyon, another biblical scholar, says that archaeology has not yet said its last word, but the results already achieved confirm what faith would suggest, that the Bible can do nothing but gain from an increase in knowledge. So it's interesting, a quick little aside, we talk about the Bible, we've talked about some sampling from Old Testament and New Testament, people, places, things, events. So how do other religions, such as Mormonism, Latter-day Saints, how does it compare to the Bible from an archaeological perspective? So when we look at the Book of Mormon and archaeology, no Book of Mormon cities have been located. No Book of Mormon names have been found in New World inscriptions. No genuine inscriptions have been found in Hebrew in America. That's part of what the Book of Mormon claims. No genuine inscriptions have been found in America in Egyptian or anything similar to Egyptian. No ancient copies of the Book of Mormon scriptures have been found. Again, we're going to talk more about Bible early copies, the manuscripts, next week. No ancient inscriptions of any kind in America which indicate the inhabitants had Hebrew or Christian beliefs. Really, no mention of the Book of Mormon persons, nations, or places have been found. And bottom line, there's no artifact of any kind which demonstrates the Book of Mormon is true. Those have not been found. So the National Geographic Society, for example, in a letter in 1998, said, among other things, archaeologists and other scholars have long probed the hemispheres, referring to the Western Hemisphere's past, and the National Geographic Society does not know of anything found so far that has substantiated the Book of Mormon. So when we talk about archaeology in the Bible, it's not a small thing, right? We kind of take it for granted, but the Bible is based on history and it's based on fact. And just as legal evidence relies on eyewitness testimony and the physical evidence, biblical archaeology proves that these people, places, and things in the Bible were real and historical. And as such, these archaeological discoveries really build a strong case for the reliability of the Bible. And I think it's worth thinking about that, as that F.F. Bruce said, if accuracy is a habit, how should we feel about biblical details that can't be proven by archaeology? So in other words, if Luke, for example, the book of Luke, the book of Acts, is accurate in the places and the titles, in all the details that can be proven by archaeology. And we know that Luke was one of the greatest historians ever. You know, some of the things, what he's recorded about what Jesus said and what Jesus did that can't be proved by archaeology. You know, if accuracy is a habit, then we should feel 100% confident in what Luke said, for example, about the things that we can't know by archaeology. And it's interesting that, you know, it's not a closed book. Further discoveries are just another dig away. So that's all I had for this evening. Again, we're covering historically true. And next week, we're going to get into the manuscript evidence, the Dead Sea Scrolls. We're going to talk about how do we know that the Bible that we have is the same as what was written. You know, there's people today that claim that it's been corrupted. There's people that claim that other gospels should be in it, some of those types of things. So we'll start to get into those things as well and understand it from that standpoint. For those of you who like to do a little extra on the side, Isaiah 53, we're actually going to touch on next week relative to the Dead Sea Scrolls, actually. So if you want to read that, feel free. We're really going to dive into Isaiah 53 in, I guess it's the last class, the Messianic prophecies fulfilled in Christ. So if you read Isaiah 53, you'll be ahead of the curve for next week and later on. So with that, what time do we have here? 7:12, doing great on time. Let's see, do we have any? Adam's got the mic, he's good to go. So again, we're trying to record these so that Tom can upload them on the website. Anybody have any questions? And Adam can run the mic over to you. And Randy.
How much of the area, like over in Israel and all the Middle East, is where everything happened in that time frame? Like the Dead Sea Scrolls was not that long.
Right.
How much area has not been excavated? I mean, is there a lot of other areas to go? Are they going down, or is there just places that haven't even got to yet?
From my limited understanding, it's still wide open. I mean, they've obviously hit some more obvious areas, but I mean, what gets me is like Jerusalem's digging a city sewer, right? And they run into the pool of Siloam. And so there's a lot of interesting possibilities in places and different things that are still not excavated. So it's kind of the sky's the limit, I think. Obviously, there's been some spectacular discoveries so far, but there's other things out there. It's just, and it's kind of exciting to think about what's going to come up next and what's going to be uncovered and what's going to be found. I've even heard things about more on a macro level, a larger scale, some of the technology that they're using today, like Landsat satellites and some of these other things. They're able to. Some archaeologists are starting to use those types of things. I don't know if this applies so much to Israel and that type of thing, but I know they're using it in areas to try to identify things that you can't really see well with from outer space with the technology, the Landsat satellites and some of those things. It's just kind of opening up a new world, some things that you wouldn't have found otherwise or would have had more difficulty finding otherwise would probably be a better way of saying it.
While I have the mic, I have one more. Are there any discoveries that have helped to critics to prove that something did not exist in the Bible by a discovery, an archaeological fact that you know of, or has everything, obviously everything that we're looking at here points towards it, but I just wondered if critics look for things to try and support their side of it.
Yeah, I think I'm not aware of specifics of like specific things that would be contrary to the Bible, but just like in any field, there's people with different worldviews, and so certain discoveries are questioned whether it fits the Bible. In other cases, I'm trying to remember the specifics on this one. In other cases, the Bible doesn't the Bible doesn't specifically address this event, for example. And so it kind of rounds it out and it adds more depth. It's not contrary to, it just fills in something that the Bible didn't cover about Hezekiah, for example, or something like that. I'm not aware of anything specifically that contradicts the Bible, but I know there are people, there are archaeologists who tend that way, and obviously they're critical. They're critical of what's found and what other people have found, which is a good thing, right? From the standpoint that after going through peer reviews and everything else, these types of things come up. That's why that James ossuary is controversial, because some scholars, for example, say, that was added on afterwards, and yet others, and for example, even the Geological Survey, that ministry within the state of Israel, said, well, there's nothing that we can tell that would make it not authentic. Good question. Other questions? Well, let me ask this. What was, of everything we kind of went through rapid fire here, what stands out to you? Stacy? Sure, yeah, well, Adam will run up there. Thanks, Adam.
It's kind of a question too, but I'm not sure that you'll be able to answer it or not. But I just think that it's kind of amazing that in a area that is mostly Jews, that probably the majority of them don't believe that Jesus was the Messiah, that there are so many that there's so many places that are still like almost protected that totally point to Jesus as the Messiah, like the Garden of Gethsemane and things like that, where it's marked off for people to come in and tour and all of that. Do they experience, people trying to destroy that, or the evidence that they do come up with these? I mean, I don't know that they care that Jesus is proven that he was real or whatever, but the church of the nativity and those kind of things that, I don't know. Do you know, is that something that bothers the Jewish people of that community that don't believe, like the common Christians?
Yeah, great question. Not that I know of. I think if you look back at the history of Jerusalem, for example, I mean the Crusades and everything else was where the Muslims and the Crusaders were going back and forth and conquering and reconquering and that type of thing. Today, and I'll even kind of rely on kind of some of the things that my friend John has told me about and showed me pictures of different places in Israel that he's visited on his numerous trips. The way he kind of explained it was that you have Jewish Old Testament type things, you have Christian things, and you have Christian tourism. And really, it's looked at, there's so many visitors that come to Jerusalem, really from a tourism standpoint, many of which want to see the Temple Mount and a lot of the things that we've seen, right, that we showed that are in different museums or they go to different areas to actually look at the excavations or whatever the case would be. So it's really a moneymaker for the Jewish people, frankly. That's when my friend John described it, that, it's for the most part, there's no animosity. It's just something else that's found that brings in tourism. And so, obviously the conflict between, the Palestinians and the state of Hamas and Israel is a whole different story, right? That's not, Hamas just wants to kill everyone in Israel, period, whatever means necessary. But when it comes to archaeological type things, I'm not aware of them trying to destroy or do anything like that. Good question. Other questions? No other questions? Comments? Wesley's got one.
Well, it doesn't necessarily relate to anything specific that was presented just a while ago, but my question is, I vaguely remember, I'm not sure if I'm right or not, but I vaguely remember some sort of archaeological evidence which pointed to the existence of Noah's existence of Noah's Ark. But I'm not sure how accurate that was. So I'm just asking, do you know anything of that? Or, yeah, that's my question.
Okay. Yeah, great question. So do I know anything of any archaeological evidence for Noah's Ark? And as my kids can attest to, I flip through the History Channel and some of those things now and then. So I've seen some things where people have made claims that they've found parts of Noah's Ark at some point in time, like on Mount Ararat, which is, at least at the time, snow covered, and so they would claim they would find some things, and then things would melt or shift or whatever, and it would disappear again. So I don't know how factual that is. And so nothing concrete, I guess, that we could say. I would personally, and this is just my opinion, personally I wouldn't be a bit surprised if God in his perfect timing would allow somebody to discover that. Because if you think about, one of the things that critics of the Bible, we listened to the guys in the movie in week 3 who referred to certain things about the Bible as fairy tales, right? And Noah's Ark ranks right up there in their minds as, one of the accounts like that. So I think it would be awesome if God would allow the Noah's Ark to be discovered at some point in time, and that clearly be out there to refute that. So the evidence is kind of sketchy of what's been found thus far, but I know some people have claimed to find certain things that don't belong on the top of a mountainside at 12,000 feet or whatever the elevation was. Mm-hmm. Other questions or comments? Was this interesting? Yeah? Cool. All right. Well, hey, if no more questions or anything, thanks for coming. Hope to see you next week.